Okay, folks, we'll begin in a minute or two, just giving our latecomers time to join up as usual. Okay, ji. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the PIDE webinar. PIDE is trying to create a learning space in Pakistan. I hope we succeed, although I'm not sure because it's a tough task. Maybe it'll take a few generations for us to have a learning space in this country, but we'll keep trying. For the moment, we are very grateful to our honored guests, including the Minister, Sania Nishtar, who I hope is here. Sani, the Minister is here. So Minister, with your permission, let me begin the proceedings. We have a number of very good panelists, but in order to start the discussion off, I'll invite Nasir Iqbal of PIDE, who is the organizer, the originator, and the innovator who initiated this discussion. So Nasir, will you please introduce the panel and start the proceedings?
Introduce the panel. So, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, fine.
Yes, thank you so much. So let me briefly introduce the worthy panel that is with us. So we have Dr. Sania Nishtar. She is the Special Assistant to Prime Minister on Social Protection and also the chairperson of Benazir Income Support Program. We also have a Ben Olkan. He's like a professor in a Department of Economics at MIT, and he is also a director of JPAL and co-director of National Bureau of Economic Research. He has a very extensive experience in working and evaluating the social protection system. With me, we have Dr. Suhail Safdar. He is a retired special secretary and former member of governance of Planning Commission. And now he is executive director of Social Protection Resource Center in Islamabad. With us, we have Dr. Noreen. She's like a policy head of CPEC Center of Excellence. And with me, we have also Dr. Shujat. Previously, he was like additional director general monitoring and evaluation at BIFP. Now he is assistant professor at PIDE. I am Dr. Nasir Iqbal, associate professor at PIDE. So with this, I'll invite Bell Onkan to basically, the idea is of this 2-day seminar is to look into the international practices and how these practices will help us to reform or improve our social protection system, and what are the global evidence, how they are financed. Then the next question is, what are the financing need to us? And if we really want to expand our social safety net to cover everybody those deserve, then what would be the financing need and what would be the shape of this social protection system? Then myself and Dr. Shujat and Dr. Noreen basically talk about these things, what would be the alternative financing mechanism. Then Dr. Suhail basically give a brief overview of the unmet social protection needs. So with this brief introduction, I'll hand over mic to Dr. Ben for the introductory remarks. Over to Ben.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nasir. I'm very pleased to be here today. Let me share my screen with some slides. Okay, Everyone can see the slideshow, yeah? Yes, great. So I wanted to take my opportunity here to take a few minutes to discuss some of the global evidence on targeting issues in social protection programs, and particularly to think about how we can think about some of these issues in the sort of COVID-19 era. And in particular, as I think, all countries around the world, Pakistan included, have had to think about, social protection has become increasingly important in the COVID era. It was always important, but particularly now, given all of the challenges people have had, it's become increasingly important. But some of the ways that we think about social protection may be different given the challenges that we're facing with COVID, which are likely to continue in various forms in the future. So I guess what I wanted to think about today is some of the global evidence, and also how can we think about that and how we should think about social protection differently now than we would have thought about it, say, in January before kind of the current crisis began. Okay, so okay, great. So, by way of introduction, whoops, here we are. The COVID crisis has created lasting economic impacts with great uncertainty, and both because of the sort of the direct impacts of the policies that were put in place to fight COVID, various lockdowns and things like that, but also COVID has created a big economic shock, okay? And both of those things have created a need for social protection, I think on a larger scale than probably was done before in many countries, Pakistan included, but also perhaps in new forms and focusing on different people than before. So many countries, in fact, almost all countries around the world, have enacted or expanded their social assistance programs in the last 5 or 6 months in response to the COVID crisis. And so the question was, and when they were doing so, kind of in the initial period, say in April or March, right when the crisis was starting, many countries basically utilized the existing systems or platforms they had in place, right? So they sort of said, look, what can we do with the systems that we have, and how can we expand these to deal with the current crisis? So, for example, in Kenya, authorities use the existing sort of flagship Inua Jamii program. In Brazil, they expanded Bolsa Familia. In Indonesia, where I do a lot of my other work, they expanded a bunch of other programs that they had in place. So basically, what happened when the crisis first hit was every country sort of looked around and said, what are the existing mechanisms that we have? How can we adapt what we have in place to respond in an emergency situation? And that was sort of the right thing to do in an emergency, because we needed to sort of rapidly scale and deliver assistance to people. And you can't create new programs from scratch in an emergency. You need to sort of use the existing mechanisms you have and see how they can be expanded. So that was the right thing to do sort of in March and April. The question I think that countries are facing now is, how should we be thinking about designing, how should these systems and programs be designed or redesigned over the coming, say, 12 to 24 months to support the challenges that we anticipate having in the future? And in some sense, that's what I want to sort of think a little bit about today. And I want to think about this in three respects. What is the scope of programs, and how should the scope of programs potentially be tied to the underlying health situation? So now, given that we expect the COVID pandemic to go in phases, it may rise in some places, it may fall. How should we be thinking about social protection differently depending on what's going on in the sort of the public health situation and in the economy? A second is, how should we be thinking about targeting issues? And I'll give you some examples of how do we think about this. And likewise, how is the way that we think about targeting issues different now than it would have been, say, before this whole began, if we had been having this conversation in January? And the third is, how do we think about delivery and digitization? And kind of my guiding principle here is that this crisis that we're in is going to last, but it's also going to evolve. And so if we get in a position like we were in March or April, where we need to do something fast, what we're able to do is going to depend on what the sort of investments and infrastructure that are built today are, so that we have those kind of new and better ways of thinking about things in the future. Okay, so that's the basic plan. So in terms of program scope, what I wanted to sort of say here is that I think that in terms of the COVID crisis, I think there's an increasing recognition that this crisis is going to last. Okay, there's a lot of uncertainty about whether there will be a vaccine, when the vaccine will be available, how long it will take for us to reach herd immunity, or even if that will happen. And as a result, we may imagine that countries are going to be potentially in and out of lockdown periods. You know, many countries have emerged from these sort of initial sort of lockdowns or quasi lockdowns that they were in March or April, but that may happen in the future, and this may come in waves. And so we want to think about building something that's resilient to sort of this uncertainty that we're going to be facing. Okay, of course, there are fewer tax dollars, right? And there are competing budgetary needs. So it's important to make sure that we make the best use of resources that are available. And so I think I think that the other thing to think about is that different policy approaches are going to make sense depending on sort of the health situation and sort of where you are in responding to it. So for example, if you think about when countries are in kind of their most extreme lockdown periods, right? When basically, you know, if you think about what happened in March or April, when basically everyone said, everyone needs to stay home, we need to get this crisis under control. These lockdowns are extremely costly. And this is particularly true in emerging economies like Pakistan, where many of the poor basically live from hand to mouth, sort of, you know, their paychecks are what they consume. So if you're going to be asking people to stay at home, the government needs to help them survive. And that's not only for humanitarian reasons, although that's also very important, but it's actually also an important component of the public health policy. It's not going to be feasible to get people to stay at home if they need to go out and earn a living in order to survive. So for both the sort of humanitarian reasons and for sort of the effectiveness of the lockdown, if you're in these periods where you need to have sort of really intense people staying at home and not working, you need to have a social protection policy that enables that to happen, okay? And so, you know, many countries have done cash transfers. Other things you could think about are direct food assistance, which allows automatic self-targeting, right? You don't need to distribute fancy food, you can distribute basic food. That can also help meet the basic needs and also help provide some additional targeting assistance. But the point is, in these lockdown periods, you need kind of a very universal transfer to make sure that that both people aren't starving, and also that the lockdowns are going to work. On the other hand, if we move out of the period where lockdowns are where we have lockdowns, then we want to think about, I think, more targeted programs. And here the idea is, with the same level of funds, and I've done some work with Rima Hanna that sort of illustrates these ideas, even with relatively high rates of targeting error, the overall welfare level of the poor is substantially higher under targeted programs than under universal programs. And part of this is because emerging economies have less of an ability to progressively tax back the transfer from the rich than developed countries do. So you may have heard a lot about universal basic incomes, but you know, in a place like the United States, if we did a universal basic income, what that would actually mean is we'd be giving a large transfer to the very poorest, but it wouldn't be the same transfer to everyone in the income distribution because everybody pays income tax. And so I would increase the sort of amount that people who have no money get, but I would actually be taxing that back for people who have higher income levels. In most emerging economies where most people do not pay personal income tax, a universal transfer basically gives the same amount of income much higher in the income distribution. So you effectively end up giving money to people who are in the 50th, 60th, 70% of the income distribution, which is a lot less efficient. Okay, so targeted transfer programs are going to look a lot better. And so the question then, which I'll talk about next, is how do we think about effective targeting? But I guess what I wanted to illustrate by sort of comparing, you know, what you have in the lockdown periods, what you have what you have in the lockdown periods and what you have in the non-lockdown periods, is to suggest that, you know, one thing governments may want to consider is developing a strategy in which the generosity or the type of social protection programs are tied to the public health response automatically. Okay, so many countries, for example, are classifying their territories into like red, yellow, and green zones, for example, depending on what's happening with the pandemic. And when you're in a red zone, you have the most intense lockdown to sort of to cut down the pandemic. When you're in yellow and green, you have less severe lockdowns to encourage economic activity. Okay. One thing you could consider is that when you move into a red zone, that could automatically trigger in that, say, district, probably not province in Pakistan, because provinces are probably too big, but say in that district, that would automatically trigger sort of a social protection system to facilitate that lockdown. On the other hand, once you eliminate the lockdown, that sort of transfer program would kind of go away automatically. And the nice thing about this idea is that it both makes the decision to go in and out of the lockdown more politically easier, because you're sort of, when you're sort of making people's economic lives difficult, you're automatically giving them the transfer, and vice versa. When you're taking it away, you're also making, you're taking away the transfer, but you're also making their economic lives easier. It couples those, so it makes them move back and forth easier. It also makes sure that you're not locked into sort of giving transfers that you sort of feel like you're stuck giving forever, because you've sort of explicitly said when the criteria for when they're gonna go away. So I think the first thing I sort of wanted to suggest then is thinking about the design of a transfer system where the sort of type of program you run and the generosity of that program could be linked at sort of a geographic level, at a small geographic level, to the public health situation in a sort of data-driven and well-defined way. The second question I wanted to say is, well, when you move to a system where you have targeted transfers, how do we think about targeting? Okay, so again, what happened sort of in March or April, many countries basically looked at what targeting data they had for their existing programs and tried to build off that, okay, and expand that in various ways. Including in Pakistan, where they sort of built off the existing National Social Economic Registry and expanded it in various feasible ways that could be done in sort of a short order. And sort of the extent to which this happened, I think, around the world was really remarkable, and I think was really a credit to the various governments that were able to do this. But I guess the question to think about now is, now that we're in the new normal and we have a little bit more time, how should we be investing in developing targeting structures that are going to be appropriate in the new era? So many countries have kind of what are called universal database systems. They have a single targeted database based on like a social economic registry, which is the basis of sort of all their targeted transfer programs. And the question is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these systems, and who is being included, and are these the right people? And I think that the most universal database systems, including Pakistan's, are based on what are called proxy-means tests. Okay, and I want to just spend a minute explaining what a proxy-means test is, because I think it's really important for thinking about these systems in the crisis. So what a proxy-means test does is says, look, we can't observe the income level of some particular poor household because it's not verifiable, right? We can't observe their income. If we asked them what their income was, there's no guarantee they would tell us the truth. So instead, what we do in proxy-means test systems is we observe proxies for people's incomes. Okay, so we observe, for example, whether they have, what kind of roof they have, whether they have a television, what kind of assets they have, and we construct a statistical proxy for their income based on the assets we can observe. And then you're targeted based on your proxy means test score, sort of a weighted average of these various assets, okay? So there are two things that are important to recognize about this. This is a reasonable approach, and it's a good approach for sort of long-term anti-poverty programs. But it's worth noting two things. The first is your proxy means test, because it's based on your durable assets, are going to be targeting the permanent component of your consumption. Okay, so if I decide to make a nicer roof or a nicer wall of my house, or to buy a durable asset, that's a long-run decision that I'm making based on my kind of forecast of my expected long-run income, right? If I get a shock, like I recently lost my job, that's not going to be immediately reflected in my durable assets, right? I might have no money to buy food, but still have a decent roof over my house because I bought the roof, a year ago, right? So the proxy means test is, because it targets the permanent component of consumption, it's going to systematically miss people who experience recent shocks, okay? The second point is that proxy means test systems are static, okay? And the data is updated infrequently. And because the goal of these systems is to target the permanent component of poverty, that's actually okay in normal times, where we want people who are sort of long-run poor, so we don't need to measure that very often. But if we're interested in sort of dealing with shocks, the fact that the data is old is going to potentially be an issue. Okay, so one needs to think about, how do we think about these issues in this new era where we're increasingly worried about newly vulnerable people or people who may have looked middle class in terms of assets but faced really severe income shocks? How do we think about those issues? So I wanted to mention a couple of pieces of research that I and others have done on some of these issues. One that can help potentially augment, not necessarily replace, but augment kind of the proxy means test system to help think about targeting issues. So one thing that we've looked at is community-based targeting. And the idea here is you can give each community, like a small village or a hamlet or things like that, a fixed number of slots, and you can allow community institutions to identify the beneficiaries. And perhaps you can base the number of slots on kind of the poverty level. And the idea is you can reduce exclusion error because you can say, look, we've given you additional slots for you to identify sort of the people in your community who are the poorest of the poor, okay, and who were missed by the proxy means test list. So you can say, look, here are the people we have on the list. And you have, suppose in your village we've said here are 12 people who are identified. We have 5 additional slots for you to identify people who are really poor and who may have been omitted. And you obviously need to think through having some community-based process to do this. You don't want to let it be done kind of willy-nilly. You want communities to think about sort of what are the definitions or criteria of poverty they're going to use. But when we tried this in Indonesia, the evidence we found was that this worked very well. And it really captured kind of the local component of poverty and reduced exclusion error. And one thing that was really interesting when we tried this in Indonesia was we had many fewer complaints about the list when it was done with a community method. And households in the community tended to better agree the list of beneficiaries kind of better matched the people in their communities. And better matched who they thought should be poor. And again, I'm not suggesting we could replace a national social economic registry with this, but this would be a way to allow communities to give some input into the social economic registry to help reduce exclusion error. And actually in Indonesia, where I've worked before, they've expanded, they've done a lot on this by sort of using a village-based fund to allow villages to identify people who are missed by the sort of national transfer programs to give additional transfers directly to those villagers who are being missed. A second thing that could potentially work is what are called on-demand applications or self-targeting. And the idea here is that in a traditional proxy means test approach, the government comes to you and says, you know, they come to every household, or they try to come to every household, and they identify the proxy means test score. An alternative approach is to open up an application window and say, look, if you need assistance, you need to come apply. And as I understand it, I believe this is what Pakistan did to determine some of the emergency period under El-Has. The idea of this application is twofold. Number one, the government might miss people. You know, it tries to be universal when it goes door to door, but it might miss some doors. And so here, people who are poor can make themselves known. And the second is, if there's some hassles or costs, you have to stand in line, you have to go to some, stand in line to get screened, the people who are less in need of assistance, they're not going to bother to apply because they think they're likely to get screened out later by the proxy means test. So when we did an experiment on this, we compared sort of this shows you sort of the consumption levels of beneficiaries the probability of getting assistance. It shows you the probability of getting assistance for people who were chosen by an on-demand application and by like a door-to-door approach. And you can see two things. For the very poor, the probability of getting assistance was actually higher in the on-demand application, and that's because the government missed some people in the door-to-door approach. They tried to get everyone, but some of the poor live on the margins of the village. They might not have get noticed by the surveyors. In the on-demand approach, they can make themselves known. So they had a higher chance of getting assistance. And for the wealthier, they had a lower chance of getting assistance, and that's because they didn't bother to apply because they thought they were likely to get screened out. Whereas, all targeting systems make some errors, and so with the door-to-door approach, some of the rich got through. And so our evidence suggests that actually the on-demand approach the sort of application-based approach can do a better job both reducing exclusion error and reducing inclusion error. And so those are things to think about. The third thing I would mention is that novel sources of data can be really important. So, the current crisis requires us to identify approaches to target everyone using administrative data, like cell phone data, electricity data, bank account data, lists of people laid off by formal industry, and sort of merging those together to find new sources of data that can be used for verification purposes to help find ways of figuring out who's poor and who's not poor that don't depend as much on the permanent component of consumption, but can depend more on sort of the current levels of consumption. So there's been some really innovative work using sort of cell phone data, for example, to help predict income levels based on sort of, where people are, how much cell phone credit people are using, how much they're talking to, et cetera. Those can be linked through sort of a universal identifier like a CNIC number as part of an algorithm to help sort of include or exclude people as well. So those are some things to think about in targeting. I want to say that sort of, in using these new sources of data, linking everything together using like universal IDs, like people's CNIC numbers, is really important. But that is only going to work if we really make sure that everybody, including the poorest of the poor, have those universal ID systems. So I think it's increasingly becoming clear that universal IDs are going to be an important component in these poverty targeting systems. But that only is going to really work if those systems are really universal. And so I think that sort of consistent with that is investing in having a really big push to making sure that everybody, including the poor, has these universal IDs, because as a way of sort of using these new data sources. I only have a couple of minutes left, but I just wanted to make a couple additional points about sort of the delivery and digitization issues. So, I think that this crisis, with sort of the importance of social distancing, has reinvigorated the move to digital enrollment and digital payments. And I'll skip digital payments for a second, but I just wanted to make a couple of points. The first is that these digital enrollment systems only are as good as that underlying data. So we did an experiment in Indonesia where we tried to sign people up for universal a government health insurance program, and we either had them come to the office to sign up, or this was a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, or sign up kind of through sort of an online-based system, and we gave them assistance signing up in the online-based system. And the key thing you can see is that in the online-based system, 43% of people attempted to enroll in the thing, but only 19% of people actually succeeded in enrolling. Whereas when they came to the office, a lot fewer people came to the office, but those who attempted to enroll actually succeeded in enrolling. And why was that? Well, what happened was people tried to enroll in the online system. They discovered that there were errors in the underlying administrative data. Like, for example, the family members weren't listed properly, and then the system kind of got stuck. And online, they weren't able to sort of do a manual override and sort of fix people's kind of information, and they were sort of limited to the constraints of what was in that online system. And so again, this just sort of re-emphasizes the importance of having really successful, a really complete, sort of a really good basic infrastructure for the online ID system in order to start using some of these digital enrollments. The second thing I wanted to mention was, some experiment with some results from India, where a move to sort of digital payments and biometric authentication had heterogeneous effects depending on the state. So in AP, for example, it actually led to faster and less corrupt payments, but in Jharkhand, it actually did not reduce leakages and reduce benefits for those who had not previously registered. And the reason was that basically in AP, the system was sort of very flexible at allowing sort of previously unregistered beneficiaries to kind of find a way to enroll, whereas the system in Jharkhand didn't have that flexibility. So people who didn't have their IDs before were sort of excluded. And so again, I just want to sort of say there's a bit of a cautionary note, which is we move to sort of more electronic and more online systems. We have to make sure that sort of people who don't have IDs or whose IDs have problems, that there's some way their data can be updated in the online system so they're not excluded from the programs. Otherwise, these things have the potential to backfire. So to sum up, in an emergency, you have to use what systems you have in place. But where we are now, I think we can forecast that there's a likelihood that this crisis may reemerge. And so we need to invest now in building out kind of an effective targeting infrastructure, so that so that we can adapt kind of our ability to deliver social assistance to the changing environment that's likely to happen in the future. And in particular, sort of this COVID era that we've entered may require sort of more dynamic targeting systems than were the place in the pre-COVID era. So those are things to think about. Okay, thank you very much.
And thank you, Ben, for giving a very excellent presentation and basically giving the idea of how the emergency situation re-emerged. The idea of this targeting and the role of this community targeting is well defined in the literature. And as you are aware that the BIS started with this community targeting, then shifted to the scientific method. And then now the mix of these two things, that would really good idea to move in such a emergency situation. Now I asked Dr. Shuja to basically give an overview of what is actual the social protection system working in Pakistan, and what are the key challenges if we want to really finance this social protection system. Over to Dr. Shuja.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. You know that social protection and social safety net programs have gained significance all around the globe as an integral part of inclusive growth strategies in many developing countries. And with passage of time, there is more spending on social safety nets. Like now, on average, it is around 1.5% of GDP overall. It is highest in Latin American countries and lowest in South Asian countries. In South Asian countries, we have right now around 0.9%. The spending also highly depend on the type of programs. Like the Latin American countries, Brazil, Chile, that have very rigorous social safety net programs. And mostly they rely on conditional cash transfers to provide on education, health, nutrition, where they have basket of interventions. Whereas in South Asian countries, we still rely on unconditional cash transfers, need-based and reactionary mode interventions. Pakistan has a long history of social safety net programs, and still we are in transition to develop a rigorous social protection strategy that can help in poverty alleviation. In 80s and 90s, Pakistan started Zakat and Baitul Mal programs, and mostly these are the need-based interventions. In 2001, we started the microfinance programs, but all these programs lacked sufficient resources, proper coverage, and systematic targeting mechanisms, as Ben was highlighted. Like budget of Zakat and Baitul Mal, that was just around few billion rupees, and it was stagnant over the time. Similarly, we don't have distinct welfare impacts over the microfinance initiatives on poverty alleviation. So I think in Pakistan, the emergence of BISP in 2008 laid the formal foundations of a large-scale social safety net intervention in Pakistan in terms of both the coverage as well as the financial resource availability. Although this spending mostly remained on unconditional cash transfers to around 5 million families during 2008 to 2019 period. And we consider that unconditional cash transfers alone might not be sufficient for poverty alleviation. However, this can be showcased as an achievement due to various reasons. First, you know that all the recipients are the women. So it has been targeting the most vulnerable group in Pakistan. Second, it has been owned by all the governments. It was started with budgetary allocation of rupees 34 billion, and every successive government enhanced the budget. So right now, for current fiscal year, the budget is around 208 billion. So there is immense improvement. Third, there is strong presence of donors and development partners. Around 8 to 10% budget is contributed by donors. And as Ben was highlighting, that coverage and targeting is the major issue. in social safety net program. So BISP has a registry, and this registry has been widely used to target the poor and vulnerable segments. And BISP also have the innovative payment disbursement systems, like there is payment through biometric systems that can help the financial inclusion among the poor and vulnerable segments. And there was system in place. So that's why, that recently during COVID-19, the government has targeted 17 million families, 45% of the population, through provision of a SARS emergency cash. And there was since this was present, there was improvement in the system. So that's why recently a Ministry of Poverty Alleviation and Social Safety Division is established, and a SARS strategy is formulated that have multi-phased interventions. I will not go in details because I hope that Dr. Sania Nishtar will explain this SARS strategy. But still, there are challenges as well as opportunities that I want to place on this forum. So first, after 2010 constitutional amendment, provincial governments have also established social protection initiatives. Like Punjab is quite ahead. They have developed social protection authority. Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government has launched health program. So still, I think there is duplication as well as exclusion, and some connections are required at federal and provincial tiers. It will also effectively pool the resources. So I suggest that a social protection framework must be developed by enlisting the roles and responsibilities of various government tiers. Second, the spending by private sector on various philanthropic activities in Pakistan is manifold than the government resources. So such resources may be tapped by involving the private sector, that may result with better coverage, innovation, transparency, and management of resources. Third, to effectively utilize the resources, social safety net programs requires flexibility in targeting. I think Dr. Nasser will explain it in better detail, because that there could be different nature and causes of poverty. For example, chronic poor, they lack asset based, and they requires a certain intervention that can create assets. Similarly, transient poor, they lack protective measures from shocks and require certain interventions that can help them from escaping the shocks and falling into poverty. And lastly, I consider that social protection programs alone are not the magic bullet to resolve all socioeconomic issues. For example, we have high malnutrition with no significant reduction over last 2 decades. Similarly, there is lack of equitable health services, and most of the poor finance from their own pockets. Education is another challenging area. For example, the latest highs 2018-19 shows that 30% of the children are out of school. And if we look the data of Balochistan, 52% of the boys and 67% of the girls are out of school. So alone social safety net may not resolve the issues. Like BISP has recently expanded its Wasila Talim program throughout country by providing cash assistance to the children for poor families to encourage enrollment and retention. However, that education is a provincial subject. So without improvement in access and quality of education, alone incentives may not give to improve in enrollment, etc., etc. Similarly, there is another area, like in Pakistan, there are a lot of subsidies, and most of the subsidies are untargeted. For example, during last year, government provided 50 billion subsidies to the utility stores, and it was untargeted. So these subsidies may be targeted for better utilization of resources. So as a way forward, I suggest that it is necessary that along with social safety net interventions, there must be improvement in existing socio-economic structure to include the poor in acquiring education, skills, entrepreneurship, etc. Access to opportunities can do, but cash transfers may not do. That is moving out of poverty. Thank you, Nasser.
Okay, thank you, Shujat, for giving an overview of the social protection system. Basically, I'll just pick a point from the Ben and Shujat. The first, that there is a big need of this social protection across the globe, and the evidence clearly support this idea of social protection. It may be a universal, it may be a targeted. It depends upon the financing need, financing availability that we have. But when we look into the dynamics of Pakistan, and it's well-known phenomena that over 50 million people are struggling in different shapes. As Shujaa said, some people have like income poverty, like more than 50 million people fall in income poverty. Then there are a number of people, though they have this education poverty, so they are out of school. And then there is this idea of health poverty. They don't have access to the health facilities. And last week we called this an environmental poverty. So they don't have basically protection from these environmental issues. So if we keep all these things in mind, then it means so that the program should cover not only this target, this income poverty, where we are basically giving them some sort of cash to support food. There is a need to redefine this whole scenario to optimize the existing financial resources to maximize the outcome. Like if we are targeting the education sector, then the package would be different. And if we are talking about the health sector, then the package would be different. If we are talking about the food subsidy, then the targeting system would be different. And if we are talking about the employment, as Ben is also working on this, the different graduation program, and they are testing with the different beneficiaries. So with this, we at PIDE has developed 4 different packages that basically, the aim of these packages to redefine this whole social protection system and maximize the outcome. So I'll briefly touch upon these packages. Basically, the idea behind this that we should judge the program and based on not on the intention. So the idea is to look into the outcome, what really we want to achieve. The first, the package that we are suggesting would be the employment intensive package that gives some sort of like, as Dr. Sania Nishtar knows, that there is a rickshaw driver, there are thellas, and there are technical education that basically give them some sort of a breathing space if there is a youth in the household. Then the next package basically is talk about the education intensive package. Here, our focus would be the transfer meant for education, not for any other purpose. And the next package would be the health. If there is a disabled household, people in the household, if there are old people in the household, if there are 2 young people in the household that need special health care, then the third package could mainly focus on this, the health side. And the fourth package that we are proposing is food intensive package. So the idea behind these packages, instead of running more than 100 different activities and spending most of the income on these unconditional cash transfer, where the needs of the people is different. If we allow people to choose one package from these 4 packages, and there would be some sort of criteria behind these packages, that really will help us to basically optimize the use of these resources. So we are talking about to include everybody in the system, but based on their requirement. If they are looking for the employment opportunities, we can include them in the employment intensive package where we can give them some sort of training, some sort of asset transfer. Then if there is a household that really need an education support, that package basically is only target the education. So these are the packages that meant to increase the efficiency as well as the outcome of this whole, because we are struggling with education, we are struggling with the health, and we are struggling also the unemployment. So we should have to revisit this whole set of social protection system to align with the needs of the people and to as we said in the economics, what would be the optimal use of these resources. So with the given financial constraint, and the next speaker basically will talk about what are the alternative financial resources, because the government has allocated 208 billion rupees for this social protection system, and within the COVID situation they have extended to more than 250 billion. But this was a one-time allocation that government hardly afford. What would be the future of these type of intervention if we really need resources? So at the end, I will ask Ben also to shed some light on how these can be contributed. With this, I invite Dr. Sohail Safdar to give the idea of what type of actual requirement we have in the nature, and what would be their nature, and how we basically put some ideas in terms of looking the way forward of this SAS program. Over to Suhail Safdar.
Dr. Suhail, kindly unmute yourself, sir.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you so much, sir.
Okay. And my slides are also shared? Okay. When I received this invitation to speak on this webinar, I was very happy to say yes to this because this is linked with the work that we are doing. Many of the colleagues present today know that we have established Pakistan Alliance for Social Protection, and then a dedicated think tank on social protection by the name of Social Protection Resource Center. I remember the first meeting that we had on 13th of February. Dr. Nasir from PIDE was also present in that meeting where we discussed the issues related to COVID. And when I received the agenda, I requested Dr. Nasir to let me speak after Dr. Shujat and Dr. Nasir himself, because I was fearing that in this webinar, social protection would be used as a synonymous of social assistance, income transfers, direct and indirect. And I'm not happy to say that my fear has been actually confirmed, that in the last three presentations, particularly the last two, Dr. Shujat and Dr. Nasir, nobody uttered the word social security institutions. Nobody talked about the right and responsibility of the state. And here, I would start with I'll very briefly, these are the partner organizations of Pakistan Alliance for Social Protection. You see, Professor Ben Olken asked this question, that COVID has forced us to ask this question, that what we could have done pre-COVID, which should have helped us during COVID and after COVID. We also posed this question to us, and our response was that we wish that we had not neglected the institutional social security, work-based social security. Then our situation would have been different. We would have known where to take the aid, not complain about the absence of data. The work done by Dr. Sani Nishtar and her division is excellent, was much needed. But even if you look at the relevant literature of ILO, World Bank, the safety nets for poor, they have an importance in the countries which are afflicted with legacy of poverty. But I think to replace the word social protection with the poverty reduction strategy paper, and to say and do all those things that we have been doing, in a way, I would say that it's an admission of the fact that PRSPs did not work, so you needed income transfers. That is fine. That is important. But on this slide, all that is shown above, that is institutional social security. And if a country takes care of the institutional social security, then the need for income transfers is gradually reduced, one would say. You would always have people who would be long-term unemployed. You would have people destitutes, which would need state support. But basically, most of the needs of the people are met by the institutional social security. in this context, I think when we talk about financing, there is a need to unpack the word universal and then social protection, the word social also. There's only one condition where social assistance becomes a universal social protection. That is a complete closure, such a closure of the economy where work cannot bring you the protection. Now, we had that in COVID, though not a very long one, as long as we had in, let's say, World War II. But still, this is a hypothetical poll that we saw, that this is possible when the traditional social security institutions, the systems introduced by the states, become dysfunctional, and you have no choice but to give to everybody. That's the sense of the universal in this construction. But I would like to draw the attention of the participants to the other hypothetical poll also. The literature says that this is possible, that if a country takes care of the work-based social security, you do not need social assistance. Now, that hypothetical poll is also as important as the other hypothetical poll that we have seen. So in this context, usually there is a mixing of universal social protection with universal basic income. And once you start talking about the universal social protection, immediately people would say that it's not affordable. But we say, in our context, at our Social Protection Resource Center, the vision that is informing our research as a think tank, our job is to complement the efforts of the government by producing high quality knowledge. There, what we say is that let's define first the unmet needs. What do you call something as an unmet need? For us, this is the failure and neglect of the institutional work-based social security, which has accumulated over time as unmet social protection needs, which initially could be helped somewhat through social assistance programs. But in the long term, we are already out of COVID, and we know that the impressive and huge social protection stimulus, COVID-related stimulus packages have remained largely unutilized. If the government wants to enhance the volume of social assistance transfers, conditional, non-conditional, that is very fine. We think that that is important. But what in the medium to long term would we continue in this way, that people continue accumulating their vulnerabilities, and they let money go out of the household on account of health, on account of court expenditure, for example, and we keep on increasing the support to them. So in that context, the time allotted to me is very little. I have just identified 7 major questions that in any debate on financing universal social protection in Pakistan, let's say, we need to address a couple of questions academically, through research, through evidence, that would help us improve our responses better. So when we say the unmet needs of social protection, we are not talking about the universal basic income. We are talking about concrete building blocks like old age, like disability, like unemployment, like pension, like health. And destitution, of course, is there. So one has to go to that level and to go to the subnational level. And I'm very happy to report that our think tank is actually developing a state of social protection report for Pakistan, where we are doing the district mapping on the basis of the unmet needs and the provisioning which is there. And then our report would be soon out. So we have to discuss it, whether the social assistance and social security regimes are mutually exclusive or complementary, and which should be the foundation stone. What is basic, what the government, and here when we say government, it's not only the federal government, these are the provincial governments, these are the local governments, which need to develop a consensus. We have now a long list of institutions apparently dealing with social protection, starting with social security institution in the provinces, old age benefit institution, workers welfare fund, and now we have many new, Dr. Shajat counted those institutions. So there a consensus has to be there that what do we really want, how to create complementarities between the institutional welfare, which has been neglected. You see, I mean, one simple example, only 10 million formal labor exists in Pakistan out of 60 million. And out of those 10 million, the secured workers number is only 1.3 million. So that is how the needs are being created. In that context, this is good to hear to all these scholarly debates on socioeconomic registry. For us, NSER is a useful tool, as is the multidimensional poverty index also. But NSER is NSER the answer to quantify the needs of social protection? That is another question which is important. I have already talked about the need of having a proper institutional arrangements. Now, our work over the last many months tells us that there are two universes, statistically speaking. That is the old age and the severe cases of disability, which should be taken out of this exercise of exclusion and inclusion. The misery and pain and suffering of these two universes is immense, and a very bad comment on our sense of solidarity, and the resource requirements is also not that big. We all know that the employees' old age benefit institution covers a tiny number of the ex-workers. 75% of Pakistani older people have no social protection whatsoever. And we have this phenomena of hitting our older people with those disease clusters which hit in Korea 20 years later. The disease and infirmity picture of the older people in Korea at 75 is visible in Pakistan at 55. The disability also, we are happy that ISAS is also taking care of that, but I think we need to be much more bold on this account. And these two issues are, we have our views on the structure of the social protection system between the federation and the provinces. But I think on the account of disability and pensions, we need to have a national system. And then we talk about the financing requirements on that. Now, another missing element is that health. What does it mean? You see, taking health as a contingency, this notion has to change. This is a basic right. Essential services to health is a basic right. And there now, this is good that we have bold schemes like Sehat Sahulat in KPK. In Sindh, we have a lot of experiences in microinsurance also. But there we need to have a more open debate that whether these social insurance schemes, would they reduce the out-of-pocket expenditure? Or would they improve the quality of care? Or would they improve the key health indicators? So there we should not go into adopting the social insurance, so-called, or health insurance through private sector. If evidence says, the global evidence says, and there there is only one last slide, sir, but I must point out before I conclude that our work is based on the global evidence. So whatever we are suggesting to debate is not at all a critique on what good work is being done on ISAS and the use of technology and modern techniques to enhance the effectiveness of the transfers. And the last but not the least is the key decision one needs to take, that what is the role of government in providing social security benefits. Right now, the system is that government does not put a rupee in the system between the employers and the employees, whereas in a lot of countries, government pays up. Indirectly, we have started picking up, let's say, the premium for the health insurance schemes. But instead of using the word insurance, which in Pakistan even otherwise creates issues, can we talk about the linkage between the savings and the future needs of social protection of Pakistani citizens through an institutional arrangement? Government of Pakistan did introduce this voluntary pension scheme after 10 years in 2007, but failed to put in place the right kind of institution. So should we enlarge the scope of the traditional employee social security institutions and make it into a national system and make it as the mainstay of universal social protection in Pakistan and have social assistance delivered wherever it is needed in the most sophisticated way that we are doing here. So finally, I would say that there are many questions. The COVID has made us all aware that how thin our social protections have been, and hardly 1 week into COVID, we were talking about which kind of death to choose, hunger or disease. This should not have happened had we equalized the social protection in the country. So once we are clear about the basic questions, then financing, it would be easier to discuss the financing options. And of course, we believe that contributory schemes play a major role in having a robust, reliable social protection system in the long term. And there, I think there is a need that we critically look at all the above questions and then develop a consensus and take the necessary actions to now, at least after post-COVID, there's a lot of money around, there's a lot of allocations around. Why can't we pass a big chunk of this money through the employee social security and give the targets to the employee social security institutions to integrate as many as possible unorganized sectors in the formal social security in a given time frame? In 5 years' time, we would have a much bigger coverage. Let's say 50% of government gives the target, the federal government, of 50% secured worker in Pakistan by 2025 and 100% secured workers by 2030. The vision of providing minimum social protection to all the citizens as their right and as a responsibility of the government could be fulfilled. Otherwise, I fear that the route that we are pursuing with more interest may not take us there where we say that we want to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. for giving a broader overview of this basic need and old age benefit. Basically, what we are talking about is the social protection system and how we can incorporate this old age and also the disabled people within that system. So with this, now I ask Dr. Noreen to give what would be the alternate option available to us if we really want to expand this social protection system. And as Dr. Sohail said, we have to include these old age people as well in this system. So over to Dr. Noreen.
Yeah, Assalamu alaikum everyone and good evening. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I would be discussing the existing options. Let me share my screen so we can discuss the existing options which are available and which are basically, yes. So basically, I'm supporting the arguments which Ben has given for the targeting about the financing option towards the social protection. Also, Dr. Nasir and Dr. Shujat, who have given that we have to target rather than giving everyone cash in hand, we should focus on the specific areas where the financing options are required. So usually when we are talking about the social protection programs, they are usually financed by the government. But today the focus of my presentation would be rather than focusing on the specific areas which are exercised by the government, for example, reallocating public expenditures, increasing tax revenues, lobbying for aid and transfers, using fiscal and foreign exchange reserves, and also borrowing or restructuring existing debts. We should focus on some more innovative ideas so that these social protection programs can be financed efficiently. For this, what I have done is I have divided these social areas into different domains. Rather than focusing specifically on poverty alleviation, I would say, like Dr. Nasir has already said, rather than focusing and giving them cash in hand and focusing on poverty alleviation, we should be focusing on health, we should be focusing on financing opportunities, which should be exercised for the education, for the poverty. Then it would obviously serve for the SDG goals in terms of SDG 1 as well. Now coming to the first one, that is the social impact bond, that is paying for the success and the social benefit bonds. So people should be more towards the social benefit impacts that are given through these bonds if these are exercised. For example, these are exercised in Germany, India, and these country lists are given in the next column. So these are the impact bonds. So basically what you need to do is you need to synthesize the economy and the general public so that they should come towards some kind of impact towards the economy rather than giving them a specific or a generic term. For example, talking about the diaspora bond, which has been exercised and which has been adopted very successfully in Israel and India. They have been focusing on their diaspora with a specific impact, with a specific image, which they wanted to have it in their economy, for example, towards the education. They have utilized their diaspora for education bonds. They have utilized their diaspora bond for the health as well. So rather than going for a generic term for your economy, you should be going towards the specific agendas and areas. Now, I would focus more on the product cred, which I guess can be exercised in Pakistan as well. What product cred is that, for example, there are giant brands or the huge brands in the world. They have joined their hands for the 8 African economies to eradicate HIV and also the COVID now. For example, product cred includes your red iPhone. That also include your red products in Gap, red products in Nike. What they do is they create their specific line of their product. Out of those sales, 10% or 15% straight away goes towards that particular cause, which in these terms, in this particular product red term, is your going towards the elimination of HIV and COVID in African economies. The debt conversion bonds or the debt swaps, for example, rather than paying towards your creditors your loans, these economies, for example, Gambia and Kyrgyzstan, they have changed their debt payments towards their social causes. For example, they have converted their loan payments or servicing towards the improvement of education sector or towards the education of their health sector. So that is another option which can be exercised. Financial levies are also one of the options which these economies have been exercising. And now coming towards the health sector, there are different agendas. For example, in terms of the health sector, there are countries who have been exercising the taxes on the unhealthy food items. So that is one option. Sin tax are applied on those products which are socially unacceptable to some extent. So the taxes can be imposed on those items. So it depends in economy to economy what items are socially unaccepted, and the taxes can be imposed towards those items, and they can be obviously linked towards the improvement of their health sector. Now again, diaspora has done really well in terms of health sector in India, Lebanon, and Israel as well. Luxury taxes have been utilized by China, Bulgaria, and Indonesia for the improvement of their health sector. I'll go quickly because we are running out of time. So the education sector, again, the debt servicing can be utilized, the diaspora bond, education impact bond, as the other speakers have already focused, that we should be very much specific towards the financing options, and we should be very specific about the social protection program rather than having the unconditional transfer. We should be focusing on the conditional transfers, so that should be linked towards the specific area where we are focusing on. So education impact bond and the private and public partnerships which are being exercised in different economies, and they are done really well, and the private fundraising schemes can be adopted for the improvement of your education sector as well. Why I have included tourism in this? Because in terms of CPAC, we know that tourism is something which is the area which the government is also focusing on. So we can generate funds from there as well. That can be tourism consumption taxes and the traveler saving funds on those destinations. So these can be utilized towards any of the area which you think should be focusing on towards the education, towards the, for example, unemployment you were talking about. So obviously these types of funds can be utilized towards those areas as well. Again, to the last one where you are talking about the poverty, you are also talking about the environment as well. So when we are talking about the environment, so there are the climate bonds and the green bonds which have been introduced by different economies. Now, specific towards the Pakistan, what I think is that the social impact bonds, where obviously some kind of impact can be introduced towards the general public. Secondly, diaspora. Obviously, if we can move the diaspora towards a specific cause, we have already launched the Pakistan Banao certificates, but I guess the term is broad. We can make it specific towards the education sector, towards the health sector, so that obviously we can go for the patriotic sentiments as well and the desire to do something good towards their country. Product red, we have a lot of potential towards our textile sector, for example, the Khadi and the Gul Ahmad and everyone. Females are buying products from them, females are buying suits from them for around 20,000, 25,000. If these textile sector companies, the huge companies, can join hand and they can introduce a specific product or a specific line of products so that some kind of amount can go towards a specific cause for the government. Again, the debt swaps and the taxes on unhealthy foods, tourism, these are the taxes which can be imposed. As I said, the green bond and the blue bond, these are specific towards the environment. And also, if you're talking about the blue bond, so that is towards the water sanitation and everything. So in those, I'm quick, I know, but I thought I should go very quickly so that I can introduce the existing options which we can exercise and the world has already exercised. So basically, we have 10 years in terms of that. By 2030, we are focusing to make social protection a reality for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Noreen, for giving an alternative options to explore. Now, we have a very rich discussion on what type of social protection system and what are the global evidence and what are practices adopted in Pakistan and what type of expansion can be needed and how we can merge for a better outcome. With this, now we have like a chairperson of BISP that has a very extensive experience and also looking after this SAS program, the flagship program of the government. So over to Dr. Sania Nishtar for giving a government point of view on all these discussions that we have today.
Assalamu alaikum ji. Thank you for asking me to be with you this evening. It's a pleasure indeed. I've attempted to share my slides with you. I hope that I have been successful in doing that.
Yes.
Okay, can you see the first slide now?
Yes.
Okay. So I realize that time is short and I don't know to what extent I'll be able to cover the grounds that I had hoped to, but I will try to be very quick. My sense was that
So you can take as much time as you like. You can take as much time as you like. There's no constraints.
Okay, thank you, Nadeem. So my sense was that you'd be interested in hearing about SAS emergency cash, and I thought that I could prefix it by telling you a little bit about SAS itself. And I thought I'd start with this slide about the theory, which outlines the theory of change of SAS, because SAS is a multi-component, multi-dimensional program with more than 140 actions and initiatives, some of which are process-centered, some of which are programmatic, and everything is knitted together in theory of change. We've explained the rationale for this in the strategy document, which has been in the public domain for quite some time. In the strategy document, it has also been explained how the various policies and programs fall under its various pillars, which aspects are cross-cutting, and how they link with time-bound, outcome-based goals. So all that is schematically illustrated. The narrative of the whole strategy piece has been outlined. I use these three colors to explain how everything meshes together in theory of change. More than 130 actions and initiatives, as I said earlier, packaged, and there are various ways to classify it in addition to meshing them together in theory of change. And one way of classifying them is to look at how those mandates play out in terms of the responsibilities of federal ministries, the provincial governments, and PAST, which is the name for the Poverty and Social Safety Division, for which I have responsibility. This is a newly created division, as you know, and it's popularly known as the SAS Ministry. So the three colors align under these three heads of responsibilities. There is also another way to describe these three colors in terms of classification, and that is by the pillars under which these fall. And there are 4 pillars. The safety net pillar, the execution responsibility for which falls on my shoulders and my colleagues is. Then there is the human development pillar. And other than the education and the nutrition conditional cash transfers and the scholarship aspect of SRs, this is largely in the provincial domain. Then is the job and livelihoods pillar, and the graduation related responsibilities are on our plate, illustrated by the green, but essentially there are many other aspects related that fall within the purview for the federal ministries. And then pro-poor governance, because somebody earlier on said that a lot of the strategy piece around improving lives is also about addressing elite capture and about making the government pro-poor, and I completely agree with that. So I just wanted to let you know that those aspirations and programmatic interventions are also part of the ESAS strategy. So this is essentially another way of classifying the various initiatives and aspirations under ESAS. There is yet another way of classifying these initiatives, and as Dr. Nasser was speaking, he was talking about how the different, how social safety nets and welfare initiatives, and call it what you like, should resonate with the needs of different constituencies, with different vulnerable groups, and I completely agree with him. So in the ESAS ecosystem, there are initiatives and policies and programs that target laborers and poor elderly citizens, poor women, non-affording students, individuals who are differently abled, widows, orphans, extreme poor, jobless, those who are undernourished. And I'm sure you must have noticed it. Just last week, about 10 days ago, we launched a new initiative called ESAS Nashunama, which falls under under this particular target group, if you can follow my cursor. So just to let you know that in the ESAS ecosystem, we designed not just the interventions for different target groups, but also made sure that the responsibilities are clearly aligned, and that all of these things ultimately mesh together in theory of change, and that all of them fall under different programs and pillars, so that they're contributory to time-bound outcome-based targets. And it was a hell of a lot of planning and meshing together so many different ideas. That took about 3 months, from January to March. And I slept very little during that time, as you can imagine. Currently, as we stand today, for the purpose of communication, we communicate ESAS through these tags, through the branding of these programmatic tags. So just to give you because I know some people may not read the local language on the screen, ESAS Kafalat, for instance, is the reformed, previously run unconditional cash transfer program. It is a new program for all practical purposes. Then is ESAS Emergency Cash, which we ran during COVID. Then is ESAS Scholarships, Pakistan's largest undergraduate scholarship program, which is both need and merit-based for undergraduate students. Then is ESAS interest-free loans, targeting a particular audience. Then there is ESAS Kafalat, the asset transfer program. Then is ESAS Langars, these are soup kitchens for laborers. Then is ESAS Panagas, these are shelter homes for laborers. Then there are lots of, then there's ESAS Nashunama, which is the conditional cash transfer, the nutrition and health conditional cash transfer program. There is Asas Wasila Talim, which is a reformed version of an ongoing education conditional cash transfer program. There's Asas Darul Asas, which is the orphanages initiative, comprising both of standards for private sector and expanding the base of the government's, the orphanages that the government supports. Then there are the backbone initiatives such as Asas One Window, which is an ongoing program to be launched by December, where we're consolidating all social protection windows into one. A lot of work has already been done. Then there is Asas Tahaffuz, Pakistan's first shock-oriented safety net, work on which has been ongoing for the last 15 months, soon to be launched. Data for Pakistan, another initiative where we've spatially integrated all the survey data from the Pakistan Social and Living Standards Measurement Survey, from the mixed surveys, from the other population-based surveys, to provide a spatially interactive interface for districts and provinces to enable them to plan better and to enable them to target the poorer districts better. I can go on and on and on, but this is just a way to let you know that there is a lot in the Asas bucket. Asas is not a rebranding of BISP, as people continue to say. BISP is one of the 4 executing agencies of the social protection arm of Asas, and that is one of the 4 arms. Asas has 140 elements, of which only 7 are executed by BISP. I just want to come to Asas emergency cash now. This is topical. I'm sure there's a lot of interest on your part to understand what happened, how it happened. Before I go through that, I just want to let you know that there were 3 investments we had made in 2019, which enabled us to execute Asas emergency cash. So going back in time, March 27, 2019, the Asas program was officially approved. And subsequent to that, there were a number of foundation building initiatives. Within a week, a new ministry was created, a budget was given. We embarked on to procure the new digital payment system. All the data pieces were put in place. The expert committees were constituted. We have a number of different expert committees: the labor expert group, the value chain initiative, the orphanages expert committee, etc., etc. So a lot of spade work was done to build the foundations on which this huge program will stand. And there were 3 things that happened during that time which allowed us to execute Asas emergency cash. So what were those 3 things? The first one was a new biometric payment system, which was procured and deployed in 2019. The second one was a demand side assistance seeking mechanism, which was driven by SMS. When Ben spoke, he talked about how vital it was to have those on-demand system. And my priority ever since I took over as chair of BISP was to create one. So basically, what we rolled out and executed as Asas emergency cash was designed almost 6 months ago. But I was not able to convince everyone that we should embark this route, because everybody thought it was really ambitious and very, very bold. And I recall those 8 a.m. meetings I used to have with my colleagues when we would stand in front of boards, design this, and we knew it was going to work. And colleagues from NADRA were part of that exercise. So that piece was already, at least to the extent of conceptualization, to the extent of a deep dive into feasibility, that piece was already prepared, but not executed. The third thing that we had developed was a new wealth profiling data analytics mechanism. And if you recall, back in December of 2019, we had exited 820,165 individuals from the former BISP lists before we cleaned those lists and brought them into the Kafalat program. And we used a number of different wealth proxies to exit those individuals: government employment status, ownership of a car, multiple international travel, etc., FBR, tax-paying status. So when we designed ESAS Emergency Cash, we basically picked these three threads from the institutional backbone for ESAS that we were developing, and that is how we designed it within 10 days and prepared it for execution. So just let me take you through some of the slides to explain things in detail. So what was the context? I recall calling up Dr. Alia, who I think who may be on the call with us, on the webinar with us, and I told her, I said, I need exact numbers. How many people are daily wage earners in Pakistan? And she and her colleagues, who are members of our labor expert group, did a quick microanalysis of the labor force survey and told us that there are 24 million individuals who are either self-employed in the informal economy or are daily wages or are piece rate earners. This translated into 160 million individuals whose livelihoods had been disrupted. And I can tell you that that is what was palpable on the streets of all our cities, because people would call me and tell me that we have filled our cars with packets of ration. We want to go and distribute these rations, but when we're doing it, our cars are attacked because there's so many people who are in need. We are totally overwhelmed. And I recall 2 weeks into the lockdown, it was a very desperate situation. We were on the verge of, our cities were on the verge of rioting. And it was in this context that we pulled these three threads from conceptualization exercises that we had done back in 2019 and said, we are just going to go ahead. We did look at lessons from international experience. So a meta-analysis which was published in 2017 basically told us that unconditional cash transfers have a much lower cost per beneficiary than in-kind food distribution, and that the benefit to the local economy of vouchers is much higher than ration distribution, and that the benefit to the local economy and indirect market benefits of cash are much higher than vouchers. So this really bolstered our confidence. We started with with an envelope of 144 billion. One of the participants of the webinar said that the sum remained unutilized. Respectfully, of the 1.2 trillion, ESAS was given 144 million initially, and we were asked to reach out to 12 million families. This was subsequently increased to 203 billion, and the mandate was extended to 16.9 million families, of which 12 million were new poor. And as of today, we have disbursed in excess of 175 billion. So we've gone way past the 144 billion that was earmarked for ESAS in the package of 1.2 trillion announced by the government as the emergency COVID package. The 16.9 million impacts half of Pakistan, and it is the largest social protection program ever to have been rolled out in the history of the country. It was a huge and enormous responsibility in a country where politicians are used to disburse money in their constituencies. It was really a quantum change for me to take this proposal to the cabinet, that this is how this money is going to be spent. And we had the Prime Minister's full support to do this. So we decided, as I've outlined in the report, that we will cover the 5 million individuals who are already covered in Kafalat, and that we would give them 4 months assistance together. But in addition, we launched an 8171 SMS scheme. It came to be known as Ikasi Ikatar. And the 81, we asked people to send us their identity card numbers. Ben also talked about the importance of unique identification numbers. And I completely agree with you, because if we did not have the unique identification numbers, there was no way we could have pulled such a thing off. People started sending us their national identity card numbers. And at one point, I remember our colleagues telling us our servers cannot handle the load that is coming. We received 139 million SMSs in this country of 200 million, 139 million SMSs. Once the SMSs hit our servers, we would, I beg your pardon, once the national identity card numbers would come, we'd pass them through a series of databases. Those algorithms were assigned, and automatic messages were generated at several points. And then a queue was then accumulated, and that queue was subsequently analyzed against the wealth proxies at the end, and it took some weeks for us to do that. In any case, we were staggering messages to people in terms of cash collection. This is what has been described in the report that we put out. The message used to come. It used to, the first algorithm was that we used to check for correct, if the ID card number was correct. Then there was a sanity block list. Then there was a government employee list. Then the ID numbers would hit our database. Then the queue would be generated. There was a mechanism for sharing data with provinces. And then the assessment would be repeated. So in the report, I've described in detail how this works, and I don't think time would allow me to go over the details. There were a number of different wealth proxies which we were using, detail about which is also given in the report. Once we ascertained that a particular individual was eligible, we'd send them an SMS message asking them to collect money, and they would either go to our campsites or to franchises or to ATMs with their identity card numbers and the mobile message, and after biometric verification in real time. So I want to emphasize that the payment system was such that biometric verification was validated real time. They would receive their payment and go home. Now, there were several risks which we envisaged at inception. Number one, we were going to run these operations during a lockdown. And there was a time when many of our colleagues were working from home, but F Block, which is our headquarters, was perhaps the only building which was working at something like 50% capacity. We were also operating in a context where spread of virus was a real risk. And to hedge against that, we staggered our payments, we increased the number of cash points, we arranged special campsites, and then banks were mandated to ensure precautionary measures at the cash points. The third risk which we envisaged, and I was particularly paranoid about that, was the risk of conflicting messaging. Because when we were designing SARS Emergency Cash, there were 3 provinces who wanted to run similar schemes. And I was very nervous that if they ran a scheme of 4,000 and we were running a scheme of 12,000, there would be duplication. And it is people on the ground who would get, who would be tricked. So there was a lot of reaching out to provinces, and of course in Pakistan's complex federal polity, there are there are those who come from the same party and those who do not. So it took a lot of effort on my part to explain to them that we're going to be running things in a rule-based manner, number one, that they did not have capacity to execute, and it was best that they collaborated with us. So the fourth risk, which is not on the slide, was the security risk, because we were pushing huge amounts of money into the system. There were desperate people on the streets. There would be cash moving, and the risk of robberies, the risk of people leaving shops with money in hand was a real risk. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the risks and the challenges that we were up against when we were ready to step into execution. This is just a few images of what things look like. You know, it was the most humbling experience of my life to see 2,000 camps reporting on a daily basis on the numbers of people who would line up to receive cash, totally in an apolitical manner. The payments that we made was in limited mandate accounts. You know, there were lots of articles which were published asking why we were not making payments in digital accounts. And I think that they did not understand our payment system. So according to the current regulations of the State Bank, of the Controller General of Account, of the Auditor General, we are authorized only to put money into limited mandate current accounts, into which only the government can put money and only the government can withdraw money. The beneficiary, after a biometric signature, can withdraw money or push it into a savings wallet. Currently, we do not have authorization from the auditor, from Controller General, from of accounts and State Bank to put money directly into savings account. Even if we had that authorization, the advantage of putting money in the savings wallet is to enable direct savings, direct digital transactions with merchants. And the shops were all closed. The merchant readiness to transact through the savings wallet is currently not there in the country. This would, of course, be ideal if the retail architecture is so set up, and if we are allowed to put money directly into savings wallet, then it would be ideal, because we would not have to set up camps. We would just push money into the savings wallet and the people would go and transact wherever they had to. I just wanted to explain this slide in front of this learned audience, because this thing was again and again raised in newspapers by people who did not understand what we were doing and why we were doing this. I just want to quickly explain to you some of the attributes of the program. Number one, transparency. For the first time in the history of the country, we put a web portal out and all the details of the transactions were available on that portal in real time. Of course, this is a very old a screenshot. So you would see provincial breakdowns, and when you'd scroll down, there was a search engine available in which you could put your district and tehsil, and it would give you the number of accounts credited, debited, etc. Secondly, this was, and this is important, this was totally an apolitical program. Now, if you look at this slide, Sindh overall has a population share of 22%, but in the overall scheme of things, Sindh got a share of 31% because we got more applications of poor individuals and eligible individuals from there. As you read through the report, you will understand that in our request seeking stream, the 817 month stream, we had decided to give allocations according to the population shares. But when we finished with the SARS emergency cash and we did the assessments, we found out that the biggest need was in Sindh province, and irrespective of political considerations, we gave money to all those who were eligible. There are lots of categories described in these stagger bar charts, and the details of those have been given in the report. So just to share some numbers with you, we received 139 million requests, out of which 66 million were unique, and the rest were rejected based on a number of different exclusion criteria. The paper that we published outlines what the 5 category meant, what the inclusion and exclusion criteria were, and what the funding source were, and other details. I just want to give you a sense of the difficulties we encountered in this very new program. As the Chinese say, you cross the river as you feel the stones. This is exactly like that. First day I went out into the field, I realized half the laborers had no credit on their phones. We had to make the 8171 service free. First week we realized what an abysmally low financial literacy people had. So volunteers had to be mobilized to help people SMS. Then there are limitations of data-driven messaging. So if the head of a family had died and the daughter had messaged us for assistance, the system would message back and say, your father, identity card number so-and-so, name so-and-so is eligible. And on the first day when I was doing a radio program explaining, a girl called and said, well, this has happened to us, what do I do? So then we had to develop a workaround. Then there were other issues, expired CNICs were not working, so we got a waiver from NADRA. On a daily basis, we'd have liquidity issues, with banks not being able to cater to the volume of money. We'd have internet issues in remote places. And of course, after the first 10 days, things kind of smoothened out. Then interestingly, we found out that the retailers who would sit in our camps, came banging on my door and said, well, you are deducting a lot of tax on the 100 rupees. There's a lot of deductions on the commissions. So I realized that on their 100 rupee commission, there was a 24 rupees a federal tax and a 16 rupee provincial tax. So I went to the federal government, the provincial governments to get those taxes waived off for SARS emergency cash. And what I went through, there were layers and layers of complexity when you get a tariff waiver. Then we confronted a lot of cyber attacks, fake money, fake SMSs, fake websites, and we continue to encounter them. So there's a permanent group that looks at the nature of cyber attacks and does the resolution. Our biggest challenge was the deductions by unscrupulous retailers, because the people who go to collect money are have very, very low, have literally mostly no level of literacy. So the retailers always have this incentive to deduct money. Biometric payment failure was another challenge, and its percentage suddenly went high because these were first-time individuals who were collecting money. Currently, it is at about 7%. We had to develop a workaround where these individuals are now paid in bank branches. And then in certain categories, there was slow withdrawal. So I'm sure that Shujat will tell you that over a weekend, Shujat and his colleagues sat and did a survey, and I sat with them on the weekend. What is the reason for the slow withdrawal? And then based on the insights of Shujat's survey, we took a number of different measures, and over the next week, the payment speed got up. This is just a snapshot to let you know that when you run a new program, there are things that you do not expect, but you need to have the appetite and the courage to accept that there will be issues, and that you have the commitment and the energy and the stamina to resolve them. For us, the SAS emergency cash experience was quite a watershed in a variety of different ways. Um, Someone said right at the beginning of the webinar that COVID is likely to be a protracted problem. And even COVID notwithstanding, we live in a country where from time to time we are faced with catastrophes, earthquakes, floods, displacements. So the know-how that we have gained in designing and implementing a massive national program in real time in a context of complexity and uncertainty with speed is really valuable. And that's part of the reason why I would every night at 12 midnight try and document what was being done. Finally, the product of that was released as an interim report, but I thought it was so critical to share. We also learned new ways of doing things, and this experience made the government more data-driven, more experimental, more agile. We relied on digital ways of working a lot, and we have now institutionalized those. This program forced us to set new whole of government arrangements, which we found very useful. And we also realized how important financial literacy was, because we're trying to invest in that space now. Beyond this, as the bullet line item says, the great global reimagination of social welfare that we had envisaged in SAS, this has really brought us closer to that. And for the international audience, our message with great humility is that if you have unique personal identification systems and numbers, then there are ways to combine them with the pervasiveness of mobile phones and internet connectivity to develop similar programs. So it was with that in view as well that we shared the report even while the program is ongoing. For us, there are a number of policy questions on the table. We have 12 million new beneficiaries as our new National Socioeconomic Survey data gathering exercise is ongoing and is more than 50% complete. Are these emergency beneficiaries only? And what kind of entitlements do they have in our new programs? Will they have preferential entitlements in Asas Nashonama or in our education conditional cash transfers? We're also in the midst of a very deep-seated policy discourse on the horizontal and vertical scale of cash transfers. And of course, we look at institutions like PIDE and the Bureau of Statistics to somehow come up with the new income and multidimensional poverty numbers based on sample-based surveys, because that's not our domain. So we really hope that a nationally representative sample survey would get up and running soon. Our priorities now are to expand the base of social protection. We are very focused on getting the job done on the National Socioeconomic Registry. By December this year, our one window social protection operations work on, which has been ongoing for quite some time. I'm very committed to bringing them to fruition also by the end of the year. There is this huge landscape of poverty graduation initiatives and the other SAS programs that target other beneficiary communities on which work has been accelerated. We are making investments for financial inclusion. And of course, the discourse has opened to use even our existing data for subsidies. So we're in deep conversation with the Ministry of Power on that. So just to share this report, which is basically an account of real-time evaluation and elaboration of the methodology. I should have put the URL there, but I will send it to Nadeem for circulation to the group. I want to thank you once again for having me on the webinar. Nadeem said right at the very beginning that that he would like to promote the discourse on learning uh, as a government functionary now, not involved in academics anymore, as a government functionary involved deeply in implementation, I welcome that. We have talked about a potential collaboration between PIDE and SAS, and I extend you a hand of friendship very much. Welcome your insights, and I hope that we will continue with this tradition of holding discourses together. Thank you very much, and I may have gone well over time, for which I apologize.
Thank you, Dr. Sanya Nishtar. Now over to Vice Chancellor, Dr. Nadeemullah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I think it was very nice, very wonderful of you to take the time to give us an overview, and it's a very detailed overview. I was personally very, energized. I learned a lot today, and certainly you've expanded the program a lot, and it's well worth reviewing. Let me quickly go to the floor because unfortunately we're running out of time, so might as well do it. Let's go to first Rabia Awan from Pakistan Bureau of Statistics.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saab, for giving me the floor. Thank you, Dr. Saiba, Dr. Sania. It's a wonderful presentation, and it's given us a lot of knowledge about the whole process. And I wish you best of luck for the future programs. On the slide of your policy questions, you asked two things. One about the multidimensional numbers. So for the information that the district level survey for PSM 1920 has completed and the data processing in progress, and most probably by end of this year, we will have the multidimensional numbers. The other thing which I have also mentioned in my text that PBS is conducting a nationally representative and provincially representative survey to gauge the impact, the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19. And that results will also, that module also includes the social protection module and the coping strategies people have adopted and how much assistance they have got from the assistance programs. So that will give you the idea and the level that how much people have gained from it and how much they have impacted. I think the presentation from the professor is also very impressive, and I think we should these presentations should be shared with us to make our policies for the things which we need to implement in the future. Thank you very much. This is only for the explanation, not for any question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Rabia. Syed Mustafa. Syed Mustafa is probably gone. So let's go to
I'm
Shoaib
still here. Sorry, I was muted though. But thank you so much, Dr. Saab. And Dr. Sania, once again, congratulations on the whole thing. Even in hindsight, I don't think there could have been done any better, the emergency cash transfer. My question pertains to, of course, the most important aspect of the debate, which is financing social protection. We've spoken about, especially Dr. Saab has spoken about, extending social protection to all individuals throughout the life cycle. Naturally, that is where financing actually comes in. When we look at the Alan Greenspan report of 1980, these financing institutions, especially the Social Security institution in the US, it sort of could not finance itself. It was forced saving essentially. When we look at the systems in Europe, they also don't finance themselves, and there is always government intervention required. The real question for me as a citizen is, to what extent are we actually dealing with notions of decommodification of labor, and where exactly would we be drawing the line between, let's say, taxation, because essentially, end of the day, whether we call it a bond, whether we call it government borrowing, it would, end of the day, result in taxation either through inflation or other means. So where would we draw the line? So if the panel can sort of explain that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Sure. We'll come to the panel in a minute. Let me just take the 2 or 3 questions and then we'll come back to the panel. Shoaib Salim.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Saab. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ma'am Sani. It's an excellent presentation you've given. Thank you, every panelist. An excellent thing Dr. Noreen said that probably the international brands, we need to learn from them, the policies they actually run for their employers, their workers, the social protection fabric they are using. Some of the companies here, I belong to Sialkot, and some of the big brands are working here, making international sports goods, surgical items, and leather products. They actually force the owners of the companies to do this kind of social protection for them here in Pakistan. But this circles needs to be more stretched out. And I would say the ISAS program recently witnessed more than 46 million plus distribution in Sialkot. But I believe we have actually learned a way here in Sialkot due to COVID-19 that we need to come out of the conventional ways of doing business, subsidizing different kind of support mechanisms and providing education mechanisms. We have learned a lot. All those businesses which are doing typically these 3 major lines I've mentioned over here in Sialkot, they switch themselves towards making with the PPEs and other support mechanisms which are being used nowadays in the world for the protective measures of COVID-19. Now, Pakistan getting support from Sialkot are one of the biggest exporters of PPEs. Finally, Dr. Sania, I would like to request you, there's one thing that I've personally observed, that there are very smart drainages when it comes to our social public system or when it comes to our economic planning cycles, that we need to be more cautious and we need to be very smart. We need to outsmart all these kind of loopholes and drainages, which will end up having all those financial assistance and protection measures falling into the wrong hands. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nadeem sir, for your time given.
Thank you, Ji. Waqar Sumro sab. Sumro sab.
Dr. Manzoor Sumro.
Manzoor Sumro. Sorry, my mistake.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much working with you while you were Minister of Science and Technology for a short stint, and I was chairman of Pakistan Science Foundation. So I know your way of working. My question here is, you talked about the financial illiteracy. Did you not in this experience felt at the time that overall literacy is a bigger problem? Illiteracy is a bigger problem, and if some of the resources of next national exchequer are extended to education overall, that could help the people at large. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question, Shahid Mahmood.
Sir, Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Welcome, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. A very nice discussion. I'm Shahid Mahmood, research fellow at PIDE. Just a few observations, and I won't take much time. Quick observations, not in any specific order, but let me first begin by stating that as a student of economic history, what do we learn from economic history about aspects like anti-poverty expenditures and everything like that? Well, you go back to the whole history of this thing. For example, in England, they have a very well documented history of anti-poverty expenditures going all the way back to Elizabethan era. And what does the historical evidence say about overcoming poverty and inequality? And that there is only one word. There is only one word, and that is economic growth. No social safety net. No, they won't do it. If you are looking at poverty, inequality, and taking care of it permanently, like the Chinese have, they've brought out 700 million people out permanently out of poverty. There's only economic growth and inclusive economic growth, not social safety nets, not cash handouts. That won't do. These are temporary. These are temporary in nature. They are not permanent in nature. They won't bring out people out of poverty or won't help income inequalities that persist in society. Now, one of the interesting things that Dr. Sania mentioned was that they received 139 million messages for help. Now, just a quick reminder that Pakistan's anti-poverty efforts or these kind of efforts go back all the way to 1950s. It's not current. It's not after 2000s. In 1950s, we used to have a lot of rural support programs that are still continuing in one form or another. And then definitely some institutions like in 70 EOBI came up in 1970s. Pakistan has had an extensive program and a lot of expenditures going towards this aim. But then let me put this question this way. If you are receiving 139 million messages after all these expenditures, including PSDP, including BISP expenditures that are about 1,000 billion now by now, what does that say about the effectiveness of social security expenditures that have been done since long or till now? So let me ask, why couldn't you build a savings buffer? Why couldn't they build a savings buffer that they could use in these kind of circumstances? Is it a policy failure? Why didn't policymakers think about it? And third, and the last one, you need quality institutions to make these kind of things work. So for the last 1 week, my mother has been admitted in Islamabad's most well-known private hospital that charges a ridiculous amount of money, all right? But their services, I'm sorry to say, their services are so pathetic. It took them 4 or 5 days just to find out what the problem was. So I'm thinking in terms of what the situation is in public sector and especially in rural areas. So suppose now, so for example, now the government is handing out, Insaf cards. But let me ask you the question, what about the quality of hospitals in Pakistan? How does it help? You are the government is making the same mistake that I've pointed out again and again. You are just.
I think your point is well taken.
Okay.
Point
You are
is-
just the government and its policy. It's again all towards the supply side. What about the demand side? What about the quality of institutions? They are not there. Thank you.
Fair enough. Okay, let's go back to the panel and see. Minister, would you like to take the lead? Let me just add something to what Shahid said, Minister. While your SAS program is increasing and while the government's welfare program is increasing, yesterday and the day before on Twitter and Facebook, there were a lot of pictures of street vendors' capital being destroyed in Islamabad. We've done a number of webinars on excluding the poor. We've taken out a whole magazine on excluding the poor, because the poor are actually excluded from opportunity. So if you're excluding them on the one side and giving them opportunity on the other side, giving them welfare on the other side, is that a good balance? Or do we need more opportunity and more growth to really get rid of poverty? And I'll invite the minister and Ben Olkin and others to comment on all this questions that have been asked.
No, definitely. I mean, there is no question that those who are disadvantaged should be given economic opportunities, and that sustainable economic opportunities are much better. In simple terms, are much better than government handouts. There clearly is no. There clearly no two views about that. The specific incident that you may be talking about or referring to is the removal of the vending stalls. And if that is the case, then we know that this is a very complex dynamic. These opportunities are not regulated. They need to be. There are mafias and all kinds of illicit activity that happens around this. And I agree that the government needs to focus on formalizing these arrangements and making sure that these economic opportunities to poor individuals are given in an even-handed manner and without the dynamic of elite capture factoring in, as it usually does in the distribution of such economic opportunities. The Prime Minister has raised this in cabinet meetings on several occasions. So I completely agree that these things need to be done in a streamlined manner. Dr. Manzoor talked about, I'll just touch upon a couple of things that have been mentioned. I'm sure the other panelists will be too. He talked about financial literacy and asked if I was worried about literacy rather than financial literacy. And of course, there are again no two questions about the importance of literacy. But here we are going to a laborer's camp when each one of them owns a mobile phone. So even these illiterate individuals who've had no education opportunity know how to operate cell phones. They own cell phones. And this is a huge disruptor and an opportunity that we could tap. And it was within this context that I said that if they had been better literate financially, they would have been able to benefit from SR services a lot better. So it was within the context of the 8171 campaign that I had raised this. The last colleague talked about economic growth and the importance of economic growth in reducing poverty. I completely agree. I mean, that's one of the most sustainable mechanisms of poverty reduction. Wherever there have been massive quantum strides in poverty reduction, we have seen massive economic growth and the ability of governments to accrue the benefits of that growth equitably to populations. And there is no arguing with that. But in every population, there will be individuals who will require hand-holding and social assistance. So they will be the disabled and widows who cannot work and the extreme poor who will require social assistance. And I think a challenge for every government is to ensure that these individuals are properly targeted, that there are minimal inclusion and exclusion errors, and that the government has a system that is responsive to their needs and does not sit on data for 10 years. And that has a system of developing live registries that are responsive to the needs of people and has the ability to deliver money spent with integrity. And that is what we're trying to focus on. Yes,
Okay,
over.
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me go to Ben Olkin. Ben, do you have any comments?
Thank you. Yes, I had a few comments based on all the discussion. I think this has really been a terrific discussion, and I really enjoyed everyone's presentations. I had three things I wanted to say. The first is I think that the emergency cash assistance program that Dr. Sanya described, it really is very impressive, and I think it's a really terrific example of how to use kind of the story of how sort of some of those things were sort of, those building blocks have been put in place and they were able to be drawn upon in the crisis to sort of stand up this really large program very quickly, is exactly kind of a sort of a prime example of what I was talking about how building the foundations and the infrastructure can allow you to adapt dynamically in the future. And I think that the question, in addition to sort of thinking about what the next phases of AHAS are going to be now, I would also encourage the government to be thinking even more, thinking as well about what are the other kinds of infrastructure that you would like to build or put in place so that the next time something happens, you're able to sort of have an even more robust system that you can draw upon. I think that some of the things about dynamic, obviously universal IDs through like CNIC is really critical. But bringing other kinds of data into play, making it more dynamic, all those things are going to be really helpful the next time that there is something like this that's going to happen in emergency, and there will be, whether it's a new COVID shock of the type I was talking about, or other kinds of economic or other kinds of shocks. Shocks do happen. The second thing I wanted to say is, of course, I agree with the comment that inclusive economic growth is the best long run strategy for reducing poverty. I think we all agree with that. However, that doesn't mean there's not an important role for social assistance and social protection programs. And I think that those are, number one, economic growth takes a really long time, and we have people who really need help now. And there's a really important role for providing social assistance for the long run poor, social protection for those who face shocks, to enable people to invest in the next generation and sort of, for human capital and other things for the next generation. and to enable people to overcome credit constraints and invest in businesses and bring themselves up from poverty. Those are all different roles for social protection to play now, and that can complement sort of overall economic growth as part of an overall poverty reduction strategy. I think those are all really important. And the third thing I wanted to say was I think that both Dr. Shujat and Dr. Nasser in their comments raised and also Dr. Sania talked about different types of programs with different goals. Whether it was different packages for health and education, all the many different, I lost track, 100 and something different components of a HAS. I think one of the things that I think is maybe kind of the next frontier of sort of targeting is how do you identify which individuals would benefit most from different types of programs. And some of the work that our team has been doing with the BIOSP ministry and with Kafala is trying to think about one particular aspect of that question of how do you get the right people into the right kinds of programs. But I think to me, as you're developing kind of not just a one size fits all, but sort of multi-different programs, sort of figuring out which programs are more effective for whom is a really important question, and actually one that I think there's an opportunity to really sort of advance our knowledge on. So I'll just leave those as my comments. Thank you all very much. It was a terrific discussion.
Thank you, Ben. Since you are an expert in this area, I think I have to pick your brain a little. Is it possible for you to comment? Is there a relationship between social protection and growth? Should we aim for the kind of social protection that Sweden or Norway has? Is it going to slow down our growth? Is it not? Or let me put it slightly differently. Here's a little graph that I drew up. Is the relationship between social protection like this, if you can see it, or is it not? Or is it an upward sloping curve? Is it like a demand curve, or is it an upward sloping curve?
That's a great question.
Give me an idea how much social protection should we aim for?
That is a really terrific question. And honestly, I wish I had a good answer to say what is the slope of that curve, or even what the sign of that curve is. It's not obvious to me that curve is downward sloping the way you draw it. For example,
okay.
It's not.
It could be negative. It could be positive.
Sure. For example, think about human capital investments, right? So I think one thing that I think we know is that sort of investing in the next generation and sort of encouraging education investments in the next generation could lead to higher levels of economic growth in the long run. And so if you think that a lot of these houses,
if I kept education out, then you'd agree with me the curve is negative.
I think education and health, I think there are other types of human capital investments like health investments, for example. So I think we know that preventing stunting, for example, of young children is something that we think has very high long-run investments. So my only point is that even certainly when you think about the next generation, it's not obvious. If you think about the current generation, I think there are some types of programs where you can actually encourage them to encourage people to invest in businesses. So I think it's not even obvious to me that the curve is negative, and even if it is, it's not clear what the slope is. So I think, and also I would say that the constraints to economic growth tend to be much more things about, what is the overall kind of regulatory and investment climate, what is the macro situation of the country look like. The things that are determining the level of economic growth are less, I think, about the social protection and more about other things about the economy, in my opinion. But I don't have great data on that, but that's my suspicion.
Last question. The West actually developed social protection after they grew. Their acceleration or their burst in growth was before they developed social protection, or am I wrong?
I'm thinking about the answer to that question. So I think that in general, I think that we do think that most countries, as they've grown, have become richer and sort of created more social protection systems. I think you're right that sort of the Industrial Revolution sort of happened at sort of a time of where there was relatively less in social protection than there certainly is now. But sort of those things did evolve over in the same time over a period. But I think that I don't think that's the right question to ask, in the sense of, I think that first of all, we know a lot more now about social protection systems. We have better technologies, we have better understanding of these systems, we have better ability to deliver them now. So just because, the US or the UK went through something over the 19th and 20th century doesn't mean that a country like Pakistan or Indonesia or wherever has to go through the same trajectory. We can go a lot faster. And I think that we can take advantage of all of the sort of the things that we've learned from the developed world and sort of try to have a better experience than the other countries have.
Yeah, appreciate that. Okay, Dr. Safdar Sohail, you wanted to say something?
Yeah.
Unmute yourself, Safdar, unmute yourself.
Okay. Well, I was just saying that when I was coming to attend the webinar, I expected that a lot of research issues would be raised, and that has been actually the case. So I'll respond to some of the comments made by other speakers as well as the questions. You know, one of the major questions which all that SAS is doing is wonderful, but should we take out the employee out of the industrial relations to take welfare or support or services to him? Now that I think we should boldly face this question. Where is the employer? We are, of course, taking social assistance to a large number of people. In COVID, we had to take it to a bigger, but still the missing middle is there. One way to look at this 139 million messages is that the low middle classes, they are also very vulnerable. Another question Mr. Mustafa asked about the government's contribution. Now, the social security institutions run on the contribution of the employers, and in case of EOBI, 1% by the employee. But they're working very well. If you look at the average cost, they are very, very low. For me, for many analysts, and NSCR is about the value for money, which is very good. But when we are embarking upon these new schemes like Sehat Sahulat, let's compare the costs. Somebody talked about a private hospital charging exorbitantly. I think this is a high time that we create quality knowledge. And then the last thing is that this is the knowledge which would save us from confusion of taxonomy, you know, which we should have a national consensus on picking the word to guide us in the long term. Are we going to use social protection equal to social assistance equal to charity, or we use a different term? And I think in that context, discussing the models, I'm sure PIDE would undertake much more research, and we already have discussed between PIDE and the Social Protection Resource Center to have a common research agenda. What models are we talking about? In Turkey, in Malaysia, government picks contributions for a large number of people. In Malaysia, 23% is taken off the payrolls and 11% is paid by the government. In Turkey, out of 82 million population, contribution for 10 million for the health is picked up by the government. And you had shown that graph that's a too big research item, would have a lot of studies in that. But why the out-of-pocket expenditure is very low in the countries which have preferred institutional welfare, like UK, for example. So
can I just
discuss those
Safdar, can I just hold you up for a minute? The minister needs to go. So if she hasn't gone already, let me just bid goodbye to her. Minister Sahab, thank you very much for being with us. And anything that PID can do for you, we're always ready to do. So, but I think she's already gone. So I'm a little late. But nevertheless, I hope it will be conveyed to the minister. We're always ready to help any part of the government. PID is a government institution, we're ready to help. So go ahead, Safdar.
Yeah, sir, what I was saying was that there's a huge research agenda. This is a too important topic for any country, particularly for a country like Pakistan. So producing high quality research, comparing and contrasting the options which have been adopted in different countries in South Asia in particular, elsewhere also. So this webinar has thrown up a lot of research ideas, and I'll suggest that Dr. Nasir in particular do a critical summary of the discussions, isolating key research themes which appear to be emerging, and then we join hands to produce high quality knowledge to help the policymakers, to help the development sector in terms of social assistance also. But I think there are two important issues, too many, which could not be covered obviously in this one webinar. We should perhaps have more, but after producing high quality knowledge. Thank you.
We will, inshallah. So, Sabzar, we are with you entirely. Nasir and Shujat, Ben needs to leave. So, unless you have something to say, if you have something to say, we'll bid Ben goodbye. Ben, thank you very much for being with us. And we are grateful. We acknowledge your interest in taking out time to help us. We will try and produce more work and send it to you and get your
terrific. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Nasir,
much.
whatever you like.
No, sir.
Nasir,
Over from our side.
You have the floor. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. As Shahid Saab said that Dr. Shahid has given the example of China, that China have a very robust growth strategy. So I think, and I suggest that Pakistan also adopted an inclusive growth strategy, where social safety net could be one pillar of inclusive growth strategy, but not the entire strategy to elevate poverty. For poverty elevation, you have a special focus on high efficient and sustained growth, the growth that can create jobs. And second, we have to invest on social inclusion. As I was telling that in Balochistan, more than half of the children, they are still out of school. So we have to invest. We have to invest on education, and we have to overcome regional disparities to build human capacity. And second, we have to eliminate market and institutional failures and social exclusions to level the playing field. And as Ben has told that, you know that right now, ISA's strategy has some 134 policy pillars and initiatives. And this panacea data has been widely shared because I was the part of the ISP. And every provincial and federal program and lot of even private organizations like AKRSP, etc., they are using the data. So ISAS and this they has to done a mapping of beneficiaries that how there could be various beneficiaries who are getting assistance only from BISP, some are getting assistance from other provincial programs. So such mapping can also tell you the effectiveness of social safety net and social protections right now in Pakistan, that how much there could be duplication, how much there is exclusion. So it can even help to build a dynamic registry of poor peoples in Pakistan. Thank you.
Fair enough. Nasir sir?
Thank you so much, sir. So I just to conclude this by saying that there is no doubt the growth is basically the prime thing to uplift the status. These are the helping tools that definitely support in terms of the people those actually need these things. So that the growth, no one can deny the role of this growth and development strategy. But we should have to be more vigilant while talking about the poor, those don't have even the human capital as well as the access to the resources. For that, we need to look into these type of things. And Dr. Softer rightly said we have to be more vigilant on conducting a well research of this topic and come up with the solution that really help us to solve these issues in a very sustainable manner. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a wonderful discussion. The minister really gave us a very good presentation. Everybody had probably we had too big an agenda, but nevertheless, it's good. We started this. We'll do more of this, inshallah. We'll have more on social protection. But I do think that we need to worry about whether social protection is negatively related to growth or not, because the way I look at it is our social protection has increased and our growth has gone down. So there is something to think about there. And the way I look at it also is that we have excluded the poor for the last 70 years. And maybe some of my friends in Synth Club tell me that it's good to give poor handouts because it keeps the status quo. We exclude the poor from cities. We exclude the poor from putting up street vending. We exclude the poor from living in cities. We have kachi abadis and throw them out. We have no poor school for the poor. We had a webinar on schools recently. All the poor schools are being destroyed by the judiciary and by the civil service. There are no playgrounds for the poor. There are no libraries for the poor. So we give them social protection. I mean, does that balance out? Is that an equation that we should think about? Or is it just about designing more and more and designing more and more and handing them out? I'm not sure whether that's doing anything. And Ben Olkin, I certainly don't agree with him on that. The curve is negative. And I think if you do a search, you'll find out the curve is negative. We really need to build for our times. We are trying to build something. We're trying to build a Rolls Royce on a $2,000 per capita income, which is, to me, a bit of a stretch. Nevertheless, thank you very much, folks. Great discussion. Enjoyed it. Inshallah, we'll do it again soon. Bye-bye. All the best. Khuda Hafiz.